Hello, I'm John Lee, Professor of Social Studies Education at North Carolina State University, and welcome to Module 5 of our Disciplinary Literacy series focused on historical literacies. This module on literacy and history is the last of our 5-part series. We've examined civic, economic, and geographic literacies. Now we are turning to history. Of course, we have proceeded in alphabetical order, but it's actually good that we're concluding with history. Students spend more time studying history in K-12 social studies than any other discipline in social studies. So with a firm grasp of literacy in civics, economics, and geography, we can now take on this field that is so well represented in the curriculum. It's also important to note that we know a lot about history in history teaching. Five decades of research on historical thinking, along with related professional development materials and curriculum materials, give us an amazing base to work from. We know much about the ways that historians think in their field and the kinds of scaffolds and supports that we need to put in place to support students as they build up their skills from being more novice to being more expert-like. It's that base of research and deep understanding that was used to develop the 17 indicators in the history strand of Dimension 2 of the C3 framework. And remember, it's experts in the field that wrote these indicators. Historians wrote the 17 indicators, and so they represent the way that historians think within the field. The 17 indicators in the C3 framework are arrayed in 4 sections. So we're going to get right into these sections. The 4 sections are on change, continuity, and context, perspectives, historical sources and evidence, as well as causation and argumentation. Now I want to point out 2 things first. One is that you see some terms here that are related very closely to the C3 inquiry arc. Specifically, these notions of sources and evidence and argumentation. Sources and evidence play a big role in Dimension 3 and argumentation in Dimension 4. So in many ways, history in its structure in Dimension 2 shares characteristics with the overall structure of the inquiry arc. The other thing to note, and this is a reminder and we'll see this a lot as we go through this video, history is tool-focused as represented in the C3 framework. This is different than and distinguishes history in the C3 from civics, economics, and geography, which are mostly conceptual in their focus. A majority of the indicators in the history strand are tools-based, while a majority of the indicators in each of the civics, economics, and geography strands are conceptual in focus. Whether or not this reflects what we know about the field or how the field operates is something that's worthy of our consideration. It may be very well that because historians know so much about how they think within the field because of research that was done on historical thinking, that the indicators in the history strand look different. Regardless, we'll examine those and come to some clarity and understanding of how and what we should support students to be able to do. These are summaries of the 17 indicators in the C3 framework in Dimension 2 in the history strand. They cluster in 2 categories, those focused on concepts that lay a foundation for understanding the discipline and indicators describing tools or skills common in history. As you can see, and as I've mentioned several times, most of the history indicators are focused on tools. In fact, you'll see that all of the history indicators in the change, continuity, and context section, all of the indicators in the history and sources, historical sources and evidence section, and all of the indicators in the causation and argumentation section are focused on tools. So first, let's look at the perspective subsection. On your slide, you'll see descriptions of the concepts that are focused on in this section. Now remember, I'll go back to the full list. We're not starting at the top. Perspectives is the second section in the history strand. So I want to go there first because I want to talk about the concepts as they set a foundation. And then we'll go back and talk about change, continuity, and context in the other tool-based indicators. So again, this is perspectives. There are 5 conceptual ideas about perspectives in history that are brought forward in this subsection. Differing perspectives is this idea that there are, in fact, different perspectives in history, and students need to understand that those different perspectives exist. Changing perspectives is a recognition by students that perspectives change over time. So the concept here is that students not only understand perspective and that it exists, but understand that perspective changes over time. The third conceptual idea is the effect of perspective, and the idea that perspective can affect those who write history. And what we teach students to do is to have that sort of sensibility in place when they look at historical materials that have been written by others, and to think about how perspective might be reflected in that writing. The fourth is perspective and interpretation, and it focuses on an awareness of how our current perspective can impact our interpretations of the past. Now we have a word for this. This word does not appear in the C3 framework, but often it is called presentism. And this concept of presentism is the idea, the potential idea, that what we think in the present can affect the way we think in the past. And that can be a negative effect. So oftentimes people use the word presentism in the negative. But the reality is perspective always influences how we look backwards, and we want students to recognize that so that they can be aware of it as they examine the past. The third is about sources and perspectives, and this is an understanding of how we know about the past, how we know about how the past is affected by the sources we have access to. So again, it's this idea that what we know about this past is in many ways a product of the sources that we have from the past. Some people use this idiom or this idea about the winners write history. Of course, we know that's not necessarily true, but there's a kernel of truth in it, and it reflects the conceptual reality that this notion of sources and perspectives is trying to get at. That what we have from the past is there because of things that happened in the past. And the things that are there, the sources that are there, affect the way that we understand history. Now we're going to go back to the top of, in the first of our sections in the history strand. This is the section on change, continuity, and context. There are 3 tools that are brought forward in this section. And these, we might think of them as skills. I've used that word. In fact, I've used tools and skills sort of interchangeably. But the 3 tools that are emphasized here include, first, being able to place events in chronological sequence. Second, determining where events in history are represented, either as change or continuity. And the third is asking historical questions. Now note that this idea of asking historical questions may very well now map onto dimension 1 of the C3 framework, which means that if you back out to the main sections of the history strand of dimension 2, we now have representations of the entirety of the inquiry arc. Asking questions, of course this is all about dimension 2, then sources and evidence, which history pays close attention to, that's dimension 3, and argumentation, which history pays close attention to as well. Now I want to say a little bit more about these tools that relate to change, continuity, and context. We can provide students with lots of opportunities to practice these skills and use these tools through inquiry. An inquiry might include a task where students read about 2 related events in history and make judgments about whether and how these events represent change and/or continuity. For example, in an inquiry about ancient Greece and Rome, students could work with descriptions of Greek direct democracy in Roman representative democracy and make judgments about how and to what extent the Roman system represented change or continuity relative to the Greek system. Students would have to tease out the characteristics of each system and align these characteristics as more or less similar, then make judgments about whether the evidence points to similarities or differences. And this work would require more than just an examination of historical change. All along, students would have to keep in mind the chronology of the events being studied. So, an exercise such as the one I just described would provide students with opportunities to practice the skills and to use the tools that are in this section on change, continuity, and context. The next subsection in the history strand is focused on historical sources and evidence. In some ways, this is the heart and soul of literacy in history. And given the role of history in the curriculum, by extension, this is in many ways the heart and soul of what we do in social studies. We provide students with opportunities to encounter sources and to pull out information as evidence from those sources to know things about the past, about the world around them spatially, about the ways that we function as economic actors in the world, and about our rights and responsibilities, and the different things that dispositions that we have in our civic life. The C3 framework lists 5 disciplinary literacy skills related to using historical sources and evidence. These are classifying and analyzing historical sources, detecting the limitations of historical sources, summarizing the maker, date, and place of origin of a historical source, using historical sources to generate historical questions, and determining the usefulness of sources. These literacies are all interconnected and certainly iterative. As students use these tools more, they become more facile in their use, they internalize the tools, and they begin to operate at a different level, a more expert-like level. Now, we know that this is complex work. So as students encounter sources and work with sources, they need scaffolds to support what they're doing. This is where the research and the curriculum development in history has been so powerful, and there are so many contributions. There are lots of scaffolds out there to support students to do the things that you see here. Classify sources, understand the limitations, summarize them, ask questions from them, and determine the usefulness of them. My favorite is the SCIM-C tool. SCIM-C, which is an acronym that stands for summarize, contextualize, infer, monitor, and cooperate, is a very useful technique. You can learn more about it at historicalinquiry.com. And we'll look more at this tool when we do the pause, reflect, and apply activity that follows this video. The last section in the history strand is about causation and argument. Now recall, there's 4 sections in the history strand. One of them, the section on perspectives, I'm making an argument is more conceptual. The other 3, I'm making an argument, are more tools-based. So I think it's helpful for us to keep these 3 sections kind of in mind all along. One section is on change, continuity, and context, and that's tool-based. The next one, we just looked at it, historical sources and evidence, that's tool-based. Now this one's on causation and argumentation, also tool-based. This final group of disciplinary literacy tools focuses on the processes and products of argumentation. The 4 literacy skills listed describe how students generate reasons and causes for an historical event and distinguish among relative causes. Then students would use historical evidence to support arguments and critique historical arguments. This set of historical literacy skills is closely connected to dimensions 3 and 4 of the C3 framework's inquiry arc, where students are expected to use evidence to support arguments and then critique those arguments, as represented in dimension 4. In summary, historical literacies in dimension 2 include concepts central to the field, but are mostly focused on the tools used in the process of developing historical knowledge. The concepts in the history strand are focused on perspective. The tools are focused on three categories: change, continuity, and context, historical sources and evidence, as well as historical causation and argumentation. Now that you've watched this video, please complete the assessment that accompanies it and make sure to check out the background readings. They're going to fill in a lot of what I said. I've also included our pause, reflect, and apply activity that'll get you thinking about how to use disciplinary literacies in your teaching. This brings to a conclusion our videos in our webinar series. I hope that you have found these to be useful, and I look forward to working with you more as we continue to explore disciplinary literacies in social studies.